If you've qualified for Kona, Nice or Marbella, then there's no doubt that you're already racing well. But the problem that I see time and time again working as a registered sports nutritionist with triathletes who go to the world champs is that there is still so much that they could do with their nutrition to help them go faster. So in this video, I'll walk you through a step-by-step plan to avoid critical mistakes and race to your potential, including carb loading, caffeine, fluids, sodium, carbs, and more.
So the first place that we should start is your race breakfast and how to make sure it's as good as possible. Because breakfast is super important, but not necessarily for the reason that a lot of triathletes think it is. The point of breakfast isn't to fill you up and give you all of the energy that you need for your race. It's actually just to give your carbohydrate stores a bit of a top up and to make you feel good. The energy for your race is mainly going to come from the carb loading and the nutrition that you consume during your race, and we'll go through both of those things. But there are three recurring problems that I see with triathletes' breakfasts, even when they're already racing well. The first one is not eating enough at breakfast. Some triathletes just don't want to eat early in the morning, or they're cautious, having struggled with stomach upset before, but whatever the case is, they tend to have a very light breakfast. This just means that they aren't consuming the optimum amount to top up their energy stores, which is then going to have a detrimental impact, especially later on in the race. And they'll often start the race feeling slightly hungry, which isn't a good place to be. I'll go through some breakfast examples in a little bit, which might really help you to improve this if it's an area that you're struggling with. The second problem is that triathletes eat too much, so they go the opposite way. They know that breakfast is important and they want to cram in the good stuff, but they inadvertently overeat. Now this risks undigested food staying in your gut and it can really come back to bite you, especially during the run leg. So you want to avoid this, and we'll go through it. But first I want to talk about the third problem, which is eating the wrong type of food for your breakfast. When it comes to your triathlon race breakfast, you should be focusing on simple to absorb carbohydrates, which means things like white rice, pasta, sugary cereal, white toast or bread, or simple things like sports bars, gels, or drinks. Your breakfast should have minimal fat and fiber because those are hard to digest and they aren't going to positively contribute to your race performance. Well, in fact, they're just going to hinder it. So on race day, you really want to be avoiding or greatly reducing nuts, seeds, and things like full-fat dairy. In terms of protein intake, my advice is not to focus on it because it isn't really important. It can help you to feel a little bit fuller and it is quicker to digest than fat, so it's not a no-go. And some triathletes feel much better with something like chicken or tuna in their breakfast because it satisfies them. And if that's you, that's fine. Just aim for a lean protein source, so not something with lots of fat in it. Now these are all good breakfast options that you could use, and as you can see there are lots of choices and this isn't an exhaustive list. But what I'd highlight is that having a liquid only option, so for example just using a carbohydrate sports drink, which is essentially your race nutrition, is definitely possible. So if you struggle with eating early in the morning, then this might be the way that you manage it. Prepare a big carb drink the night before and then just have that as you go in the morning so that you're still hitting some good pre-race carbs. In terms of amount, my suggestion is to eat at least 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So if you weigh 65 kilos, you should be consuming at least 65 grams of carbs in your breakfast. You can use a calorie tracking app to check how much you're consuming, but I would definitely advise getting at least that amount. I've looked over triathletes' race nutrition plans before and have noticed that they only have around 30 to 40 grams of carbs in their race breakfast, which is just way too low. I found the sweet spot for most long distance triathletes is around 2 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight in their breakfast, but you can and should test this during training. And I'd recommend leaving at least 2 hours between eating and the start of your race, and more like 3 to 4 hours if possible, because this gives you time to properly digest it and it should positively contribute to your performance. I think now is also a good time to talk about something called prehydration, and honestly, this is such a biggie. You might have heard how dehydration affects performance, and know then that it's something that you need to avoid, and that's absolutely true. It is highly unlikely that over the course of an Ironman you can avoid it, because the amount of fluid you would have to consume during the race would be more than you lose through sweat. And for most people, this just isn't realistic. We'll talk about fluid intake during your race in a bit, but the best strategy that you have here is to optimize your hydration status going into the race by following a prehydration strategy. This is going to increase your blood volume through absorbing extra water, and it's a fantastic way to put yourself in the best position before your race. It's quite simple, but it makes a huge difference, and here's how to do it. In the day before your race, you should consume at least 250 milligrams of sodium in 500 milliliters of water 3 times, as well as 750 milligrams of sodium in 500 milliliters of water with your evening meal. Then you should have 750 milligrams of sodium in 500 milliliters of water with your breakfast too. For reference, this is the sodium content of some common sports supplements, as well as my personal favorite, table salt, so that you get an idea of how you might hit those targets that I just mentioned. You should also be drinking to thirst during the carb loading period, and it is really important to do this. Now, I remember when I talked through this with one of my triathletes who was just gearing up for their first Ironman, and for them it seemed like a pretty wild strategy. They were worried about how much sodium they were consuming and were like, James, is it really worth it and is it safe? The answer is yes, definitely. It's one of the best strategies that there is, and especially over a short time frame, so 24 hours, it is safe and appropriate. And you can follow this as long as you haven't ever been advised that you need to really consider your salt intake. Alright, so this is the next biggie, and it's one of my favorites, and that's partly because it's so misunderstood. And a lot of triathletes, and even the ones going to the World Championships, get it wrong. But also because I love carb loading myself, because it's so much fun. Carb loading has demonstrated performance increases of 2 to 3% in endurance events, which might not actually sound that much, but it's absolutely huge. These are the time benefits that you could get by carb loading properly, and I don't know about you, but for eating some extra carbs before the race, this seems like a ridiculous potential gain. Now, the aim of carb loading is to maximize your body's store of carbs, which is called glycogen. And to do this, you need to follow these main points. Start carb loading about 36 to 48 hours out from your race. Research shows it's not necessary to do a low carb period first to be able to carb load effectively. And it's also not very nice to suddenly go low carb, and in the days leading up to your race, you want to feel good. Eat 8 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight per day. Don't worry too much about protein, because you'll inevitably get enough anyway, and in general you should be aiming for low-fat foods. In order to carb load properly, you have to eat a lot, and the focus should be on carbs as the name suggests. Lots of protein and fat isn't helpful and will just make you feel super full. Opt for low-fiber foods. Generally, the lower fiber the better. Now again, high-fiber foods will just make you feel full and bloated, and they're not helpful for our main aim. In a normal diet, yes, lots of fiber, but not for carb loading. Eat more in the morning and less towards the evening. This is one that I found personally so helpful, and I always recommend it. If you eat more in the morning and taper towards the evening, you'll sleep so much better. If you've ever eaten loads of pasta in the evening and then felt pretty bloated, then you'll know what I mean. No super hard training during the carb load period. Hard training damages your muscles, and it impairs its ability to store carbohydrates as glycogen. So remember that all of your training is done, and so light training and activation work is all that's needed. Follow a carbohydrate loading plan. This is possibly the most important of them all, because I can be 99% sure that if you don't follow a structured plan that details how much you need to eat at what point of the day, then you'll miss your target. You can create your own plan using a food tracking app, and if you do that, just make sure you prep it in advance.
Now, I know that carb loading can seem like a complicated topic, so I've created a free carb loading guide for you, which you can download from my website. It has templates for you to use and refine, so that you can feel confident that you've got it down to a fine tee and perform as well as possible come race day. Link is in the comments and description of this video.
You can put as much time and effort into the prep as possible, but if you don't get your timings and carbohydrate amounts right during the race, then it can all unravel. Overfueling, underfueling, stomach upset or bonking during the run. Let's try and avoid those. The basic place I suggest starting for any long-distance triathlete is at 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. That means on average, I want the triathlete to be consuming at least 60 grams of carbs every single hour, averaged over the race. Now, typically what this means is that they have more on the bike, especially at the start, and then they taper off throughout the race. This is because you can usually tolerate way more at the start of the bike because you're the most hydrated and least fatigued compared to the rest of the race. And this is typically how your nutrition will look during a 70.3 or full distance race, and it's what you want to aim for. And the first specific area to target is the pre-swim snack. This should be something that's easy to digest and consume, so a gel is the perfect option. I've gradually been bumping this up with the triathletes that I work with, and I have had excellent feedback. So my guidance here is anything between 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates is the goal, roughly 15 to 30 minutes before the swim starts. So then really we're onto the bike because the only thing that you'll take in during the swim is some extra water. Classic triathlete gag. For the first couple of hours on the bike leg, this will mean aiming between 80 to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour, which you'll notice is above the 60 grams of carbs per hour minimum that I suggest. But remember, that's over the whole race, and typically this start period is the perfect time to get lots of carbs, fluid, and sodium in. So I suggest front loading here. And one of the strategies that I used with a triathlete was to ask them to take one gel per hour on top of their planned carbohydrate drink mix, which got them to around 100 grams of carbs per hour for the first 2 hours. Then it gradually decreased over the race, and this is normal and something that you should actively plan for. As you get more fatigued and dehydrated and then start running, the amount of nutrition you can absorb will decrease as well, and you can't get around that. So then what I suggest is aiming for a minimum of 50 grams of carbs per hour on the run. Now with both the bike and the run, if you can go above those numbers and tolerate them, then that's fantastic because you definitely should. We'll cover practicing later on, but it's really just to say that these are the minimum numbers that I'd like to see and are going to keep you fueling well. How you actually hit those numbers is totally up to you, depending on your individual preferences. So you could just use drinks to hit your goals, you could use drinks and gels, and you could use drinks, gels, and solid food. It's really about experimenting, finding out what you can tolerate and can repeatedly consume over hours. The next big thing to tackle is how to manage your hydration during your race, which consists of two things: how much fluid you consume per hour and how much sodium is in that fluid. Usually when I work with triathletes, I take them through the basic physiology of blood and sweat because it really puts things into perspective for them and shows why they should focus on their hydration during their race. The first thing to know is that a large component of your blood is made up of water, which is why you get the advice to drink when you exercise. And when you sweat, you lose both water and sodium from your blood, and this reduces your blood volume. The result of having this lower blood volume means that your heart has to work harder, with the main change being that it beats faster. You might have noticed that you have a higher heart rate when you're dehydrated, and this is one of the main reasons. But then, because your blood volume is lower, you have less blood being sent to your gut because it's instead being sent to your vital organs to keep them safe and functioning, and essentially to your muscles. This means you can't absorb as much nutrition as possible, and also means that your capacity for cooling is reduced, resulting in a higher core temperature and a reduced sweat rate. All of this as a combination is the physiological basis for why dehydration affects performance. And sodium comes into play here because it's the most important electrolyte when it comes to sport and hydration, as it's linked heavily to water and your circulatory system. Other electrolytes like magnesium, potassium, and calcium are all important for your health, but there's no good evidence to support their replacement during something like an Ironman triathlon, so I don't suggest focusing on them. In terms of amount, this is how much I would suggest you aim for in terms of fluid intake and sodium intake during your race. This can vary greatly depending on your individual sweat rates and the climate that you're racing in, but for both Nice and Kona, it's likely to be hot and sweaty. So I would be encouraging you to aim for the upper ends of the fluid intake mark and at least 1000 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid. Now, the eagle-eyed among you might notice that the guidance for carbohydrate and sodium differ, in that carbohydrates are grams of carbs per hour, whereas sodium is milligrams per litre of fluid. And that's because sodium intake is independent of time and should scale with the amount of fluid that you drink. And the reason behind this is that it's the amount of sodium in your blood, which is largely made up of water, which is important. And just drinking plain water can dilute the amount of sodium in your blood, causing something called hyponatremia, which can be dangerous, especially during long-distance tries. A drop in sodium is actually one of the most common causes for triathletes ending up in the medical tent, but it can be avoided by proper planning. There are two main ways to get sodium in during your race. The first is through fluid, and this should be quite straightforward. Whether you separate out your carbs from your hydration or you have them both with one drink, you can have sodium in liquid, and this is a really simple way to get it in. The second option is that you use sodium capsules during your race. So let's say that you were going for gels, chews, and water, or you wanted to have liquid carbs and separate out your hydration. You'll need to consume sodium with any liquid that you drink to make sure that you keep hitting that milligrams of sodium per litre threshold. So having electrolyte capsules available which you drink is the easiest way to do this. There are different ones available, with the most common ones being from Salt Stick and Precision Fuel and Hydration. You can work out how many you think you'll need and then add a couple of extra, and then you can either pop them out of the blister pack or take them out of the bag as you're cycling. Neither of these options are necessarily better, it's just finding out what works best for you. I've worked with triathletes who have done both strategies and performed amazingly well, so it doesn't really matter as long as you're hitting the right numbers. This section is one which, if you've got this far into your triathlon career, you might be fairly good at, but it's worth going over. If you want to race the world champs as well as possible, then you need to make sure that you've planned in advance to ensure that you're hitting your sodium, carb, and fluid goals. And then you need to understand how you're actually going to carry your nutrition so that you make sure that you smash those targets. You might want extra storage behind your saddle for bottles. You might decide to use a top tube bag, or you might decide to super concentrate your nutrition into 1 or 2 bottles so that you can then just drink water alongside your concentrated mix and then swap those bottles in and out at aid stations. You can put nutrition in your tri-suit at the back in your pockets and also down the front. And actually down the front can be super handy in the first hour or two, where you can have easy access to gels or chews that you know you're going to eat early into the bike leg. Depending on your goal at the World Champs, you can also consider stopping and using the special needs bags, but obviously that's very dependent on whether you want to spend the time doing that. But it is an option. Now, one of the things you might be thinking about is aid stations, and specifically, should you use them? You definitely can use aid stations, and really this just depends on your plans for the bike and the run. Have a look at what on-course nutrition is available and how frequently it is available. Is it nutrition that you actually like? And will it easily help you to hit your goal intakes? You should make sure that you're comfortable by practicing with your nutrition rather than just hoping it'll be fine on the day, because this is so risky and it massively increases the chances of getting stomach upset during your race. So in truth, there are a number of different supplements that you could consider which might give you the edge during long distance racing, but honestly, the number one to focus on is caffeine. It's been shown to improve times in endurance events by 2 to 4%, which is massive when you consider the time frames. This could mean that you could knock 20 minutes off your time if you were completing it in 8 hours, and the benefits just get larger the longer it takes. So this is pretty awesome, and if you're on the fence about caffeine, I would definitely suggest that you consider it. You do need to practice it during your training to make sure that you tolerate it okay, but it can be a super simple way of improving your performance during the World Championships. Caffeine helps by reducing the perception of pain and fatigue, and it increases alertness as it's a stimulant. It also increases fat oxidation or fat burning, which definitely helps during long distance triathlon. So let's run through the things that you need to know. The recommended dose of caffeine is 3 to 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. So if you weigh 70 kilos, the effective dose is 210 to 420 milligrams of caffeine. The average half-life of caffeine, which is the time taken for the dose of caffeine to harm in your body, is 6 to 8 hours, but this does vary between individuals. For reference, these products all contain 100 milligrams of caffeine, so they should give you an idea of how much you might need to consume if you want to hit your required amount. You need to factor in that in 6 to 8 hours, the amount of caffeine in your body will have halved, so you need to replace that caffeine to get the benefits. What this usually means is having a good caffeine hit before the race so that you get into the right zone, and then taking multiple smaller amounts of caffeine throughout the race to keep your caffeine levels up. So now you know how to nail your World Championship race day nutrition, and you should really work on your recovery ideas so that you can soak up the post-race vibes, and you can do that by watching this video here.